Hey there, everyone. I'm going to do something I've never done before. I'm going to talk about some books. So this week I read two books here. They're both about the kids in the hall. So I read this. First, I have these two books. This is a book about the kids in the hall by John Semley. And then I have this book, The Kids in the Hall, One Dumb Guy by Paul Myers. So these are two books about kids in the hall, right? These two books. And I have read both of these books this week. And I'm going to talk about them because they're both about the same thing. And they're both, they're different, but the content is, generally the same. So it's kind of like an easy way to compare and contrast these two books. So the first book I read, well, this book came out first. It came out in 2016. This is a book about the kids in the hall by John Semley. So let me give you a brief overview of this one. It's kind of like a kids in the hall book written by a dude who really likes the kids in the hall. So, he's full of trivia and kind of like a lot of this I think is put together from just like collected interviews and things. So whereas like the guy who wrote it is like this, I guess he's Canadian. So he will do a lot of things like, talk about the kids in the hall, but he'll give you kind of like extra information that like for non-Canadians. So like he'll talk about specific terms he's using that are related to Canadian government or whatever, like places in Canada where like he uses like some weird Canadian terms that nobody would know outside of Canada. So he talks about those kinds of things, and it fleshes out your story a bit and gives you some stuff. But like basically, it's a story. It's the story about how the kids in the hall meet, how they became a comedy troupe, how they became popular, how they got a TV show, how they made brain candy, and all the stuff that happened around that. It's a good read, but that's your general overview. Next, you've got The Kids in the Hall by Paul Myers. This is One Dumb Guy. So the name is kind of bad. Both of these books have shitty names, by the way. Like, look at these names. This is a book about the kids in the hall. Is a dumb name for a book. I mean, it's just like what it is. It's not a title. And then this One Dumb Guy one, you just think like, is the author the one dumb guy? Is that what's happening? But like actually, it's not that. It's like it's from a quote one of the kids in the hall made, like saying like we're like five smart and like interesting comedians separately, but together we're just one dumb guy, basically. But like anyway, this is the same kind of thing. You notice one thing here: the authorized biography. It makes a difference because this one is about the same kind of thing. Like it talks about the beginning of the kids in the hall, how they started, how they met, the kind of surrounding people that were also involved. You've got like their build up, their kind of like stumbling into having a TV show, their very highs and their very lows, and what they're doing now and things like that. And that's the same as the other book, except this one is way more in depth in the terms of like he actually interviews the kids in the hall for this book. So let me tell you something here. This book has a lot of stuff, a lot of interviews with them. It's not like written in interview format, but the author obviously interviewed them and already obviously talked to people related to the kids in the hall. So he like brings up topics that like this book doesn't bring up. It doesn't like even mention, right? And in like this book he talks to people not that are kind of important for kids in the hall, but are only mentioned in here, but there's no interviews of them because they're minor. So like this book ends up being like a much better book. So here, this one dumb guy, let me tell you the secret of how this book is better. Paul Myers is Mike Myers' brother. So like Mike Myers from Wayne's World and all the movies, like Shrek and all that. He's Mike Myers' brother who wrote this book. So you find out a bunch of stuff like there's lots of things where like Mike Myers is in there talking about how he was in a when they were first starting out in comedy, he was in like the same comedy class with like Dave Foley and uh, well, I think he was like teamed up with so like maybe okay, it's Kevin McDonald and not Bruce, Dave Foley are together in this class, right? And then Mike Myers is there also. And then like Mike Myers like gets hired away to do something else, SCTV or I think. So like, but anyway, like there's lots of interviews like you get all this kind of like stuff like nobody has heard of before because it wasn't in previous interviews, right? So like Mike Myers will talk about his interaction with these guys, and like then like you get more in-depth stories about their kind of like upbringing and stuff. So if you ever watch The Kids in the Hall, like there's a skit called Daddy Drank. If you've never seen it, you can search on YouTube for like Kids in the Hall Daddy Drank. And like it's a story about, it's like a goofy comedy story where like the what's it called? Kevin McDonald is basically telling about how his father was a drunk, and he like tells these funny stories about things that happened to him from his dad. But like it seems like it's a comedy bit, but actually you learn from the book that like basically these are things that like really happened to Kevin McDonald, and it's just funny in retrospect. So like his dad calls him up. It says like, "Hey son, how many girls called you today? 0? How many girls called you yesterday? 0? You know what 0 plus 0 equals? Fag. 0 times any other number equals fag." That kind of thing. So like it's like it's funny in the sketch, but like his dad really said that to him. It's like his dad said something similar, at least. It's not exactly that, right? His dad said something like 0, 0, you know what 0 plus 0 equals? 0, like, so that means like, you're a 0, basically. He's telling his son that. It's kind of a super dick thing to say. And like, he was like, "Oh yeah, I was really bothered by it for a couple of days. And then I realized like afterwards that it's hilarious. It's the dumbest thing that someone could say, right?" But like, so he's, like they made him make a story out of it, and it's funny in the show, right? But like you find out from reading both of these, that's in both of these books, it talks about that. So it's not like just this one. But like, you'll find out all types of stuff about like, basically all four of the members of the five, these four, not him, the Mark McKinney doesn't have like come from a family where there's like a drunk or abusive dad, right? So like it kind of like goes into more in depth about like how it affects their comedy. And actually this book is more like woke in that sense, where it's talking about how their abusive fathers like affected their comedy afterwards. This one just kind of like tells the story about it. It doesn't like add its own narrative in there. And you have like a lot of interesting stuff going on where like you get to hear stories about like stuff you wouldn't have heard about, because like you'll see this and you think like, "Oh wow, who knew that like Scott Thompson was like at the school where there was the first Canadian school shooting. Like he was there that day, and like some of his friend died, and like one of his favorite teacher died, and it like totally affected him for the rest of his life. There were like the first Canadian school shooting. It was like Scott Thompson's school. It's weird. Like you get all these kind of like weird tidbits of information about how these like big events affected these people, and you never you never would have heard that stuff. And like usually, so like what'll happen is like this book generally has way more in-depth stuff about almost every topic, whereas this one has like much more contextualization for it. So like this one, they'll talk about like the place where they were doing comedy in Toronto, right? And this one will talk about the same place, but it'll give you information, like tangential information about the city. So like you'll start to learn stuff about like what's happening in that area, and Canada. You learn Canada stuff. So like this book is full of Canada knowledge that like I didn't know and this book doesn't cover. But like this one is always, when they talk about the same topic, this one is always more in depth in terms of like getting the story about the people it's about in particular, because like this is like all firsthand interviews. So like one of the things I want to say was like there's a character from Kids in the Hall that's Paul Bellini, and Paul Bellini is interviewed in this book. He's like mentioned in this book, but there's no interviews with Bellini, so like this book doesn't have much. But this book has like all this stuff, and you get to learn all this stuff about Paul Bellini and how he was like, basically hired as like a kind of a wrangler for Scott Thompson, who was like a little out of control. And it's kind of interesting. You get like a really good, interesting look at how these people are. And if you're a fan, like it's really interesting to read one of these. And if you had to only read one of these, I would suggest this one. But this one, like, if you read this one, you wouldn't miss out on so much. This one came out 2 years ago. This one came out like in October. But at the same time, this one has some stuff that this one, they both have things that the other one doesn't. So this one has like all the extra Canada knowledge, and then it has like a bunch of stuff like that is like fan stuff. Like there's a Kids in the Hall drinking game in this book. Who cares? But like it's there. It's very much more like from the perspective of someone who's just like a big fan and wants to tell you all about the thing they're a big fan of. Whereas this one is really more of the kind of, someone who knows these people, is friends with them, and, also wants to tell you a really in-depth story about how they became what they are. So, like, it has a lot of stuff like that, he talks to people, he goes out and gets, like, interviews with these people that are, big names too. Like he gets interviews from people who are just influenced by the Kids in the Hall, big people like Judd Apatow and like Paul Feig and stuff like that, where like he talks to them and gets their input for like how the Kids in the Hall like affected them. He's like, he interviews Mike Myers, which is his brother, so it's really easy. But like he gets all this like extra info that you hadn't heard before from Mike Myers, and like he puts it in more in perspective. And you get there's like this ridiculous story, like when they were making brain candy, basically the Kids in the Hall break up, and Dave Foley basically just walks out on them because Kevin McDonald is like demanding that he read a letter that he wrote to him in front of everybody, and Dave Foley's just like, I'm not doing that. And he's like, if you keep asking me, I'm just gonna leave. And he asks him again, and he just leaves, right? So basically the Kids in the Hall break up, and they're contractually obligated to make the movie still, so they're angry, like they hate each other at this point, and like they're doing this movie, and it bombed horribly. It's a great movie though. If you've never seen Kids in the Hall Brain Candy, you should watch that. It's also on YouTube. You can just search for it and watch it, because like nobody is I think all the DVDs are out of print. I think everything for it is just out of print. You just can't get it, right? So watch it on YouTube. Who cares? But overall, this one especially, I read in like 2 days. It's like, it's like 300 pages, whatever. Like, it's a 2-day read. And it took me longer to read this one, but like I read it directly after this one. So like I read them directly. I like read 2 books, and like this one was harder to get through because like the writing style isn't as good. And I had just read this one, and like I kept comparing it in my head, like, oh, well, the other book shows this comparison like much better, or like tells this story more in depth. And like even though I read this one, reading this one after it like gave me some other perspectives, right? It showed me, told me some things that weren't in this one. Showed me some like parts about Canada that I wouldn't have understood it wasn't mentioned in this book, but since he like brought up these Canada things, like, okay, now I know some extra things about Canada. So like overall, these were both good books. I don't have any real complaints about these books. Like this book on Amazon, like people hate this book on Amazon. They're like, oh my God, this author wants to talk about himself throughout the whole book. He's just like constantly self-inserting himself. I didn't find it that annoying. It wasn't like he was crazy, like, hey, look at me over here all the time. But he does add some stuff that's like, who cares what you thought at that time? Like it's not important to anybody who wants to read this book. No one cares about the author. They care about the subject. So like there are some parts like that, but I didn't think it was like overpowering. Like all the like half the reviews on Amazon are literally just like this author wants to talk about himself and also talk about the kids in the hall. But I didn't feel that way. I thought like, okay, he's just inserting himself sometimes, but it's not annoying. It's not awful. So like if you look at this one and you're like thinking this one is all right, you read the reviews on Amazon, you think like, oh, maybe that's not so hot. I didn't think it was that big of a deal. It wasn't so bad. Um, the and like had I not read this one first, I would have enjoyed this one a lot more, right? So like if you're like I really want to read both of those, read this one first and then read this one because this one is more in depth and better in a lot of ways. So, but if you're only going to read one, read this one, the latest one, also the most in depth. So, man, if you're a Kids in the Hall fan, you should be over this. So, yeah, that'll do it. I think that's my first look at this. I don't know. I might do some more book reviews at some point, but who knows? It's hard to talk about books in like this kind of free form way where I'm not, I don't have any notes. I'm just going off the top of my head because usually like these are like biographical books. So it's just kind of like a history thing, right? But like in a more in-depth book situation, you have to think about writing like subtext and things like that. You can't read like on a surface level for anything and have like a good review, right? So who knows if I'll do any more book reviews, but I just read those two this week at the same time and I just thought like, hell, fuck, might as well do a review. So yeah, that'll do it. I will see you guys for more other random videos next time. So see ya.